The high jump. It's an incredibly technical event of the track and field world, where your objective is to get over this bar by any means possible. Despite this simple goal, it's gone through a drastic series of technique, rule, and record changes that are highly underlooked in the athletics world today, with some of them being the most ingenious findings in sports history. The high jump also has nearly 100 documented world records, as its history resides much farther back than just the ratified records most people are familiar with. Since there are an abundance of records to look at here, let's wait no further and get into the world record progression of the high jump. The first documented records of high jump competitions took place solely in Scotland, especially with things like the Highlander Games that became an instant classic for 19th century athletes. The first notable record was set on September 26, 1827 by Adam Wilson, clearing a height of 5 feet and 2 inches. While there aren't any physical representations of these athletes jumping during this century, it's been speculated that the form used back in the day was split between two ways: the side jump, where you'd face the bar either diagonally or from the side, or just simply running straight at the bar and clearing it that way. Both of these also used some form of a scissor kick, with other scissor variations making their way into the late 19th century. This is partially because there was no comfy platform you can land on, as you were normally landing on much harder surfaces, which had athletes primarily landing back on their feet or their hands. Thomas Anderson and John Pattison would go up another inch to 5'3" in 1829 and 1837, but Richard Armstrong would set the first substantial mark with a jump of 5 feet 6 inches, and Thomas Roper would tie it the next year. Henry Musgrave upped it by another inch in 1852, and two men would clear 5'8" the same year, which were James Methvin and John McNeil. William Tivendale would inch closer to the 6-foot mark with a 5'9" jump, but Methvin would take the record 2 more times, tying it once, beating it, then tying his own record again. In the 1860s, there was a special athlete whose name still screams loudly in the Scottish archives, and that man, of course, was Donald Dinnie. The documentation of his records are a bit scattered and debated though, as one source claims jumps of 5'11" and supposedly the first man to clear 6 feet with a 6'1" mark. However, upon viewing archives that show a slew of underperformance after another, and no documentation of these records from veteran researchers like Peter Lovesey and Eric Crow, it's safe to say that these records are a bit questionable. However, he still did manage to tie the official record of 5'10" with Andrew Milne on August 8, 1861, so the legendary Scot still pops up in modern, official world record progression texts. The record had halted at 5'10" for quite a while, as Thomas Russell, Andrew Milne, Samuel Muir, John Bell, and Gavin Talt all simultaneously held the record in the mid-1860s, but Thomas Davin would finally break the curse by a quarter foot on July 7, 1873. This finally got the ball rolling again, as Marshall Brooks upped it by another inch the next year, with Michael Glazebrook tying it. But it would be Brooks that would come right back to become the first man to officially clear 6 feet on the high jump. With this barrier out of the way, the sights were now set on the 2-meter mark, and after a couple more records from Brooks and Patrick Davin, the Americans would get their first taste at high jump stardom. On August 15, 1887, William Bird Page would be the first American to break the high jump record, with the clearance of 6'3" and a quarter. He would then break it once more for 6'4", and then Michael Sweeney surpassed Bird by a quarter of an inch. James Ryan attempted to break up the Americans, beating it by another quarter of an inch, but the Americans were simply too strong, as Sweeney took off with 3 back-to-back records in a single-month span, going from 6'5" to 6'5" and 5'8". After Sweeney's domination of the event, and influence he had with his own approach towards the bar, aka the Eastern Cutoff, the record would undergo the first hiatus since the event's inception, and it would take an entirely new technique to beat the record. The man behind this revelation would be the inventor of the Western roll, George Horine. George Horine was a high jumper from the US who developed a brand new technique that revolutionized the high jump for the next few decades. The Western roll has a much different approach than the traditional scissor kick methods, where your takeoff leg is closer to the bar. You then aggressively throw over your other leg, rotate your body towards the sandpit, then your trail leg comes down, landing on your hands normally. Horine had learned this method at Stanford after a few months of experimenting, and lo and behold, the American had seemingly cracked the code. It was also perfect timing because as soon as Horine was capable of hitting record-breaking marks, the IAAF was formed to ratify records like these, and after his record on March 29, 1912, he would become the first man to jump 2 meters on May 18th that same year. This would be George Horine's one and only ratified record, but with an entirely new era on the way both technique and ratification-wise, the Americans clearly wanted more. There will also be some records here that weren't done at sanctioned meets, but are still nevertheless going to be worth covering moving on. On May 2nd, 1914, Ed Beeson was the second man to jump above 2 meters, meters with a clearance of 2.01. Clinton Larson would jump 2.03 unofficially, but thankfully, Harold Osborne matched it in an official meet 7 years later. Osborne supposedly shattered the record in 1926 with 2.06 meters, but apparently he subtly held the bar on while clearing, which eventually inspired a rule change down the line. Walter Marty held the record 4 separate times, but unfortunately his 2.05 and 2.07 marks were done at an unsanctioned dual meet. The records throughout the next couple decades were consistent, but moving at a much slower rate now. The Western roll's accessibility and productivity showed to be a major success for high jumpers, but it seemed like the fire was slowly burning out. After the record moving by a centimeter at a time for decades, or even half a centimeter at times, a man by the name of Charlie Dumas was on his way to qualify for the Olympics at the trials, but would unexpectedly pull off one of the best jumps in high jump history. 2.15 meters, a 3-centimeter increase over the previous record, and the first 7-foot jump in human history. After decades of slow progress, Charlie Dumas absolutely shattered the event's limits and was the first man to clear 7 feet as well. The Western roll at this point was just about optimized, especially with a mark like this. While a drastic jump in the record would normally create a drought for new records to come in, this simply wouldn't happen, as another country was testing the waters with a brand new technique that would rival the Western roll, and soon enough would become entirely uncontested. This is the straddle technique. Upon first glance, the straddle technique looks almost identical to the Western roll. However, think of the straddle as more of a dive as they approach the bar facing down, whereas the Western roll goes over the bar more or less sideways and ends facing down. There's of course a lot more nuance to these techniques, but the main takeaway is that the straddle is mechanically better all around, and this became obvious when the first Russian took the record very shortly after Dumas's phenomenal 7-foot jump, as Yuri Stepanov would clear a height of 2.16 meters on July 13th, 1957. After this though, a certain American would take the record multiple times in a row, and a Russian would do the same thing shortly after. And this was perhaps the most explosive era for the high jump record in history. These men were John Thomas and Valery Brumel. In just 3 years, the record had gone up by 1/10 of a meter, whereas it took 3 decades to go from 2 to 2.1. These two men were so obscenely ahead of their time and were able to incorporate the straddle technique so fluently, but after both of them retired, the record saw its second official hiatus. Did this mean another technique was going to be developed? And if so, would it just be another version of the Western flop? The answer to that would be a resounding no. In fact, it would be so inaccurate that this new technique that was on the rise would be the single most influential discovery in perhaps all of track and field. Allow me to introduce you to the legend himself, Dick Fosbury. Dick Fosbury didn't appear to be the most talented high jumper in his high school years, as he struggled to find a proper technique that worked and was said to have been incapable of clearing 5 feet at one point. Over the next couple years, he began to experiment heavily in high school and caught quite a lot of flack for it. One article going as far as to calling him the world's laziest high jumper, while another inadvertently titled his trick the Fosbury flop. Here's how it works. You approach the bar with a sort of J-curved route, which allows you to position your hips efficiently, and with enough speed, reach more height. Being turned away from the bar, you arch your back over, keeping your center of gravity under the bar, pull your legs over, and you'll normally land on your back or head first. Fosbury's coach at Oregon, Bernie Wagner, was stunned when Fosbury shattered the Oregon school record his sophomore year, despite making him do the Western style outside of less competitive meets during his freshman year. Eventually, the two cooperated with each other and wanted to fine-tune this incredibly unconventional unconventional, yet seemingly effective technique. And sure enough, Fosbury went on to win 2 consecutive national titles. With only a couple weeks of breathing room, Fosbury jumped into the Olympic trials and qualified pretty handily. He then went on to display his unique one-of-a-kind form at the 1968 Olympics, in which he set a new Olympic record and took his first and only gold medal. Now, Fosbury sadly never went on to set any world records, but as time went on, more and more athletes began to adapt this style very quickly given how intuitively it really worked. But we do have a couple records to touch on before the flop era. Ni Qichin would unofficially break the record at a massive stadium on November 8, 1970. But the reason why this record was unofficial was simply because China wasn't part of the IAAF at the time. Pat Matzdorf from the US would officially tie the record shortly after anyways, only for Dwight Stones to beat it 2 years later, for the first ever world record using the flop, and broke it to the 2.3 meter barrier. In fact, Stones proved to be the first major successor to Fosbury, as he'd broken the record 2 more times in 1976, both in Philadelphia and just within 2 months of each other. This was the last American to ever break the record, but it wouldn't just be the Russians that came back for more, as the flop was such a groundbreaking discovery that others wanted to take the event into potentially the 2.4 meter zone. Before this, however, there was still a straddle jumper left that was putting the floppers to shame, as Ukrainian athlete Volodymyr Yashchenko would manage to pull these 2 records off. Yashchenko was one of the last elite straddle jumpers, and his 2.34 was the last straddle world record ever recorded. This cleared the air for the 80s to be the true test of the limits for the flop, and it would also bring in the most diverse set of athletes to ever grace the high jump. In 1980 alone, 3 men were able to take the record up 2 centimeters. First, Jacek Wsiola in Eberstadt with 2.35 meters, Dietmar Mogenberg tying that record just 1 day later, and Gerd Vesseg to untie it in Moskva with 2.36.
2.36. Nu handlar det om nytt världsrekord.
Since China was now recognized as part of the IAAF, an athlete from there immediately took advantage of this opportunity to pull off an incredible string of performances. Zhu Jianhua was known as one of the less muscular elite high jumpers in the scene, but his run-up and raw height he was able to get off of the ground allowed him to become a phenomenal talent, clearing 2.37 in Beijing, 2.38 in Shanghai, and nabbed 2.39 in Eberstadt, all in one single year.
Batir el récord, y ahí va. Ahí está, sí, la alegría miren usted, de la hazaña de este atleta chino.
Jianhua had only gone for 2.4 back when he cleared 2.37, but didn't go for it any other time. Instead, it would be Rudolf Polanichin from Russia who would break into the 2.4 zone after 13 jumps on August 11th, 1985. With the 2.4 barrier met, people began speculating if 2.5 was possible in the next couple decades. Dick Fosbury himself speculated that this was around the theoretical limit for humans, and athletes like Igor Baklin and Patryk Harbary were able to take it 2 more centimeters rather quickly.
Paklin, que ha establecido un nuevo récord del mundo de salto a altura con una marca de 2 metros 41 centímetros en el transcurso de las pruebas de atletismo de la Universiada que se están celebrando en la localidad japonesa de Kobe. Paklin tiene actualmente 25 años.
Höjdhopp mycket ambitiöst innan de stora grabbarna landskampade. Här sätter han världsrekord. För första gången på 11.
It seemed to be approaching another era, though, where athletes were just breaking the record once or twice and then never being able to take it again. In terms of sheer sport-altering performances, John Thomas and Valerie Brumel were the last athletes to take the record to absurd lengths. Maybe the record was truly approaching its limit, but after Carlo Tharnhardt's 2.42 tie, an athlete from Cuba was determined to take the event farther than anyone had ever gone before. Javier Sotomayor was an insanely talented high jumper in his youth despite not being a fan of the event at first, especially with a 2.33 jump at the age of 17. He continued to up his mark by a centimeter at a time over the next few years, but in 1988, he had a massive outlier within his season. He was normally jumping in the low 230s with a single 238 that was already a respectable personal best, but in his last meet of the year, he managed to get 2.4 on his first try. Instead of stopping here, he didn't go for 241 or 242. Instead, he went for 243 and got the new world record on his second attempt. A 5-centimeter personal best was practically unheard of at this level, but the crazy thing was, he wasn't stopping there. On July 29, 1989, Sotomayor was competing at the Caribbean Championships. He first tried all of his jumps until he decided to go for 2.44 meters, aka 8 feet. Missing it the first time, he still had plenty of energy to go for 2 more attempts, and sure enough, Sotomayor would become the first man in history to clear 8 feet over the bar. Funnily enough, this record was close to being invalidated once the crowd stormed the high jump pit. Because if the bar fell shortly after his jump, even if from outside sources, it wouldn't have counted. Sotomayor went the next few years more so focusing on competition wins than striving for more records, especially with how often he was attending meets. He did jump 2.4 once, but mainly stayed in the mid-230s, winning his first Olympic Games on the way. It wouldn't be until 1993 until Sotomayor was putting up his best set of jumps yet, and on July 27th, 1993, he came completely out of nowhere with this jump.
Javier Sotomayor, récord del mundo, 2.45. ¡Wow! ¡Récord del mundo! ¡Récord del mundo!
Vamos a ver
Salamanca vuelve a la historia. Salamanca a la historia.
Vamos a ver la comprobación.
¡Qué enorme alegría! ¡Qué enorme alegría! ¡Récord del mundo!
Se tome ahora en la imagen de la comprobación de este récord del mundo.
¡Qué maravilla! ¡Qué maravilla! José Luis.
2.45 meters is where the current world record stands today. It also has the lowest number of jumps anyone has ever taken for a record since 1914, only taken 5 jumps to get to the record. Sotomayor went on to have a phenomenal rest of his career, even going as far as to occupying 17 of the top 20 jumps of all time at one point. His dominance was a one-of-a-kind display of how far someone could take an event, and as the record approaches the 30-year mark unbeaten, only 2 athletes have gotten even close in 2014. Despite the sparse amount of footage and absence of genuine rivalries, the fast-paced nature of the high jump record is still amazing to look at, especially with the techniques the athletes were able to develop throughout the last 200 years that make its history one of the richest in all of track and field. As far as anyone is concerned, it still might be a while before anyone can contest the immense talent Sotomayor displayed, but to say the record will never be beaten again is simply a false reality if we've seen what can happen to long-lasting records in the past. The 2.5 barrier is still a long shot for the time being, but once the right group of men step up, the high jump will become one of the most enthralling records to root for again, and Fosbury, Sotomayor, and plenty of more athletes' legacies will live on for hundreds of more years to come. This has been the world record progression of the high jump, and thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more track and field content like this, come on over and become a patron, drop a sub, and peep the Instagram too. I'll see you on whatever video I upload next, and take care.